Good morning, church. Alan was a strong follower of Jesus. He had made the commitment to be all in to following Jesus, to live for him with everything he did, including the place he worked and how he lived his life at the workplace. And Alan was great at his job. In fact, he was an extremely successful businessman. He worked hard and worked well and was extremely successful. He had an accomplished career running a factory of a major company. And because he was so successful, because he had such success in his job, he was given opportunity after opportunity. And he was given the opportunity to become the vice president of this huge worldwide company headquartered in Texas. And he thought about it, prayed about it, thought his family out, and decided, hey, we're going to move halfway across the country. And I'm going to take this amazing opportunity, this amazing job in Texas. So like any job, he starts the first week learning the ropes, learning people, learning the ins and outs, what exactly he's going to be doing and all that stuff. And that first week on the job, his boss takes him aside and kind of gives him an expectation that he really wasn't expecting. His boss told Alan, hey, this first week in the job, I want you to fire one of your managers. And Alan's just like, okay, you want me to fire one of your managers? Maybe someone's not doing a good enough job. So Alan asks the question like, well, is someone not cutting their weight? Does someone need to be let go? Is it just not really a good fit? And the boss just says, no, your coworkers aren't scared of you yet. Your coworkers aren't intimidated yet. And you need to fire someone so they have the fear of you, so they work hard and do what they're told. And if you fire someone, they'll definitely be scared of you and be intimidated. So Alan now has to make this tough decision. He asks this question, does anyone need to be fired? It's like, no, just fire someone randomly. And he has to decide, do I fire someone or not? Well, the boss added another wrinkle. He said, unless you fire someone, you will be fired. You will lose your job unless you fire someone. So now Alan's really in a tough spot. He either has to ruin someone's career or he has to lose his job that he just moved across the country and uproot his family and lose out on his ability to provide for his family. Well, Alan weighed his options, but to him the decision was obvious with being a follower of Jesus, and Alan chose to get fired and lose his job that day. Now, I'm sure Alan's boss and to his coworkers and to a lot of people of the world, what Alan did was unexpected. Now, his unexpected actions, I'm sure, led people around him to think or believe or to do something because unexpected actions point people to something. When we do something unexpected, people take notice. People pay attention. They begin to think. It makes them wonder. It makes them ask questions. An unexpected action can point people to something. We're in our second week of our series, What's Missing? We're going through the series asking the question, what's missing? Because sometimes we get in our life where we're trying to live for Jesus, but we want to be all in, but we're struggling to live the way God calls us to live. And we ask the question, what's missing? And last week we determined that what is missing is humility, because humility changes everything. And we learned last week that Jesus is the perfect example of humility lived out. That he did that by emptying himself and giving up his life for us. If we remember, we look at Philippians chapter 2. Here's what 7 and 8 says of Philippians 2. But emptied himself, Jesus, by taking the form of a servant. Being born in the likeness of men and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So we learned that humility is emptying ourselves, putting others ahead of ourselves, emptying ourselves like Jesus did. And we asked the question last week, what would happen if we lived with humility? What we learned last week to answer that question is we would truly live. Because if we truly had humility, we would submit to Christ. We would die to ourselves and give our lives to following Jesus. We learned, as Jesus taught us, to be his disciple means first we deny ourselves, which means we say no to our will. Then we take up our cross, which means saying yes to Jesus' will, living according to Jesus' plan and purpose. And then thirdly, he said, follow me. Follow Jesus means we put our faith into practice. If we do all those things, we will truly gain life. Gain a life with hope, meaning, and purpose here on earth, and gain eternal life with God in heaven. But we must have humility to do all of those things, to deny ourselves and put our lives in God's control. And this morning, in our final week of this series, we're going to be asking that question again. What would happen if you and I lived with humility? What would happen? What would change? What would God do? What would we do? And today, again, we're going to look at the life of Jesus to help us answer our question, what would happen if we lived with humility. Because in our passage of Scripture today, Jesus did something he did time and time again. He did the unexpected. Jesus was all about doing the unexpected. And when we did the unexpected, people took notice. It pointed people to something. It led people to something, to think and act and believe in something. Today we're going to be studying out of John chapter 13, verses 1 through 17. So you open your Bibles to there, tap on your phone. We're going to be in John chapter 13, verses 1 through 17. John chapter 13 is the beginning of the night of the Last Supper. Jesus is less than 24 hours away from his death on the cross. And then on this Thursday night before that Good Friday where he goes to die, Jesus and his disciples are getting together to celebrate the Jewish holiday Passover. Passover was a holiday to remember God leading and rescuing his people out of slavery and bondage in Egypt. Now they're in the city of Jerusalem, and they're most likely in an upper room of a house having this Passover meal and this celebration. And here's what John records in the first verse of chapter 13. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in this world, he loved them to the end. So John tells us that Jesus knows the time has come for him to leave this world. Jesus knows he's going to die the very next day. And John adds this interesting side note that Jesus loved his disciples to the end, likely meaning two things. That Jesus loved them with everything he had, and he loved them to the very end until he gave up his life on the cross. And Jesus is going to display that love tomorrow on the cross, but he also is going to display his love for disciples in a number of ways that night. See, Jesus wants to take great advantage of his last moments with his disciples to prep them and prepare them as they're going to go out and start the church. He wants to make sure that they're ready to live according to his will, to make sure that the world will know about Jesus. John continues in verse 2. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all the things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So we now know the meal is in progress, they're beginning to eat, and also he lets us know that Judas has already made plans to betray Jesus. See, Judas is one of Jesus' 12 disciples, and he's the one responsible for leading the Jewish religious leaders to find Jesus that night, to ultimately be arrested, to be beaten, and to be crucified. So among these 12 men that Jesus is with tonight, one of them is not for him, but against him. And that's one of the reasons what Jesus is about to do next is so unexpected. John continues on in verse 4. So he, Jesus, got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. What is happening right now is an extremely cultural event, washing of people's feet. See, because like about a month ago, Kara and I had some high school students and some small groups leaders over to our house for a game night. And neither one of us greeted people at the door with a basin of water and a towel washing high schoolers and adults' feet. Why? Well, one, that would be weird. But two, we don't do that in our culture. But in Jesus' culture, that was very common practice when someone would enter someone's house. See, understanding in that culture, everyone wore sandals. Everyone typically wore sandals, and typically people traveled on foot. Most streets and roads were made of dirt. Very few roads were paved in that time. And these roads that people walked on were covered in heavy dirt and mud. And by the end of their travels, their feet, they'd get pretty gross, pretty nasty, pretty dirty. And so as a person would enter a home, there would usually be a large pot of water with a pitcher and a basin and a towel. And as you entered the home, the servant would come over and clean off your feet, pouring water over them and drying them with a towel so that your feet would be clean entering the home. Now, this was considered one of the most menial tasks for someone to do. It was to only be performed by the lowest of servants. In fact, it was such a lowly task, Jewish servants were not required to perform this task, only Gentile servants. It was a lowly task, and the task of washing someone's feet was reserved for a lowly servant. Well, when they get into that upper room, there is no servant there to wash Jesus or the disciples' feet. And what should have happened is one of the 12 disciples should have volunteered to wash everyone's feet, or at least wash Jesus' feet, but they don't. Luke 22 tells us, in fact, what they did instead was they got in an argument about which of the disciples was the greatest. Most likely they're arguing about this because they want to sit next to Jesus. And whoever's the greatest gets to sit next to Jesus. So while they're arguing about who's better than the next, Jesus starts to get up and do something. He gets up and removes his outer garment, the posture of a servant, the posture of a slave, and he goes over to the basin and the pitcher and the water, and he goes over to each disciple, kneeling down before them, taking off their sandals, and washing each and every one of his disciples' feet. Have you ever been in your house? And for me, my spouse will get up and she'll start to do some activity, start cleaning, start doing some chores. I instantly think, do I need to be doing something? Do I need to get up and do I have a job I have to do? You kind of have that like, oh no, my wife's going to get mad at me because I'm not doing something I was supposed to. Like, I can't imagine the embarrassment and the shock these disciples have as they're arguing about who is the greatest. Jesus gets up and takes off his outer garment and begins to wash these disciples' feet. They have to be embarrassed, filled with pain and shame as they watch their leader take a place of a servant, do the lowest of lowest tasks and washing their feet because they got distracted about arguing who's the greatest. See, they were willing to fight over the throne, but we're not willing to fight over the basin and the towel. Well, Jesus is washing their feet, and he gets to Peter. And Peter, like the rest of them, is kind of filled with shock as Jesus is doing this, and he asks Jesus, are you really going to wash my feet? And Jesus lets him know in verse 7, you do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand. And Peter basically argues with, like, no, you cannot wash my feet. I love when Peter tries to argue with Jesus. It never works out for him well. Well, Jesus says this in John 13:8, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Well, Peter hears this like, well, I don't want that to happen. I want to have all of you. I want to be a part of you. So he tells him, don't just wash my feet, wash my head and wash my hands. Peter's missing the point here. And Jesus makes it clear to him in verse 10. He says, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. Jesus lets Peter know, like, I'm not here to make you physically clean. In fact, you're already clean because you have given your life in submission to me. You are my disciple. You are following me well. This isn't the point of washing your feet. And he lets us know, like, Judas isn't clean because he doesn't trust in me. He's going to betray me. So therefore, he is now not clean. So Peter allows Jesus to wash his feet. Jesus washes everyone's feet. And Jesus puts his outer garment on and he poses a question. He says in verse 12, do you understand what I have done for you? You ever been in a classroom and your teacher asks a question and none of you want to answer because you're like, I don't want to be the stupid one that gets it wrong? Like, I would love to be a fly on the wall in this moment right here where Jesus asks this question. Did they try to answer this question? Did they give it a shot? I'd love to see what they say because I'm sure they're all thinking like, do you know why I did this? Do you know why I did this? I'm sure they all were as confused as one another. Well, Jesus answers the question for him. He says this in verse 13. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example, for you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. So Jesus is now explaining his why. Here's why I did this. He reminds them, hey, you call me teacher. You call me Lord. And you should, because that is what I am. Those titles, teacher and Lord, those are roles of influence, of high position. A role that is not expected to enter a room and wash other people's feet. Jesus wants to understand the role that he has in the act that he's doing. And then Jesus tells him to do something unexpected. He says, now wash each other's feet. Jesus states, I have now set the example of what you are to do, that they should do the very thing that he has done that night, to serve one another. See, we must remind ourselves what Jesus said in Mark chapter 10. This is kind of Jesus' mantra. Mark chapter 10, verse 45, he said, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. See, Jesus didn't come for people to serve him and wait on him hand and foot and look to him for all these things. Like, no, he came to serve, to put others first, to put people in a place where he could serve them. And now he's calling his disciples to do that very thing, to serve others humbly. Jesus has set the example. Now, we must understand, yes, Jesus is calling his disciples to wash each other's feet, but that's not ultimately the goal. He's not expecting them for the rest of their lives, every time they go someplace, to wash each other's feet. And he's not expecting us to do that now, either today. We don't do that anymore. The example he's setting is to follow the command to serve humbly. He wants his disciples and you and I to have this mindset where we serve with humility, that we serve humbly, that we are willing to serve each other in all types of situations. Then in verse 16, he lets them know, hey, if you think you're above this act of service of washing each other's feet, understand, the servant is not greater than the master. The messenger is not greater than the one who sent them. And basically saying, if the master, the leader, is willing to do this lowly task to serve in this way, then you need to be willing as well. They are not exempt from doing the tasks Jesus was willingful to do and cheerfully did. And Jesus concludes, if you follow this example, you live out this lifestyle of serving humbly, you will be blessed. This word can also be translated happy. You will have happiness and joy from doing these acts of service towards each other. What Jesus did that night was an extremely humbling act. What Jesus did took humility. Like I said, Jesus is the example of what humility lives out looks like. Jesus did the unexpected that night through his humility. And Jesus is calling his disciples, he's calling you and me to live out this same example, to be humble, to live with humility through service, to serve others, to humbly serve. So our question for today is, what would happen if we would live with humility? What would happen if we truly lived the mindset of humility? We would point people to Jesus. If you and I chose to live humbly like Jesus did that night in the rest of our lives, we would day in and day out, each day of our lives, point people to Jesus. Because humility points people to Jesus. Jesus' actions that night pointed his disciples back to Jesus. And it calls us to serve and live with humility that will ultimately point people to Jesus. See, when we empty ourselves, not only do we gain true life, but we allow ourselves to help God point people to His Son, Jesus Christ, and to experience life-saving life from Jesus. Jesus pointed people to Himself by acts of humility, by serving people and loving people, and ultimately giving up His life for all mankind. Those acts of humility pointed people to Jesus, and we are to do the exact same thing, to live with humility through acts of service that point people to Jesus. See, Jesus was willing to live humbly, to deny Himself, take up His cross, and do God's will, and we need to do the same. Deny ourselves, take up a cross, and follow Jesus. Let's be people that do the unexpected as Jesus did, and put others first. Paul writes about this idea of putting others first in Philippians chapter 2. We read the second half of Philippians chapter 2 last week. Here's the first part of that section through verses 3 and 4. Paul said, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of the others." See, Paul encourages us not to pursue selfish ambition, to make our lives all about ourselves, which is a challenge, right? That's a challenging thing to do because we want to make it about ourselves. Paul says, throw that mindset out the door. But rather, pursue a life of humility, and in your humility, put others first. And he says, value others than above yourselves as you value yourself. And if we do that, we will do the unexpected. He says, look to the interest of others first, not your own interest. And we do that through serving other people. We look to the interest of others first by serving other people because you and I were created by God to do good works, to love and serve people. Paul wrote this in the letter Ephesians 2:10. He said, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." God created you to serve, to love, and to do good works. He didn't create us to be selfish and all about ourselves, to be prideful. No, He created you to lovingly serve people. And that takes humility. We are called to live a humble lifestyle where we are pointing people to Jesus through the good works we do. If we call ourselves followers of Jesus, our goal is to make more followers of Jesus. And one of the best ways you and I can do that is to humble ourselves, quit thinking only about ourselves, and serve other people. Because if you choose to serve other people, you will help lead people to a loving God, to a loving Jesus who loves and serves you. So if we live with humility, we can point people to Jesus. And Jesus gave us an example that night of doing something unexpected that should be expected as we choose to live for Jesus. Should be expected as if we choose to live with humility. Jesus' actions that night not only gave us an example of the importance of serving and putting others first, I also believe there's three big takeaways from that chapter that we can take, that we need to know and understand and put into practice in our own lives if we want to strive to point people to Jesus. A lot of you started working in high school and got some, pretty basic jobs. And for me, one of my first real jobs was working at Arby's here in town. It was a typical fast food job. I would work the counter and take orders, or work the drive-thru and take orders. Sometimes I'd get to use the fryer, which was great because I didn't have to deal with people. And then other times we'd have to clean, during the time we're working there, or clean really good as the store would close. But like any fast food restaurant, there was a lull between lunch and dinner time where we would be really slow and not that busy. And as a teenager, I loved it because I got to stand around and do nothing and get paid for it, like one of the best things on earth. And our managers didn't like that necessarily. They wanted to keep us busy, so they'd find tasks for us to do. And one of the tasks that one of our managers decided to do was, when we were slow, was to go out and pick up trash and clean out the parking lot, sweep the parking lot. I hated this job. I like to argue with people, and as a teenager, I was way worse, and I would argue with my managers like, I'm not doing that. I don't want to do that. Because to me, that seemed like the worst job humanly possible, because I thought I was too good for that job. Because I thought, that's a job for someone. It's like basically saying, hey, you're not good enough with people, so go to the parking lot. Hey, you're not good enough to cook the food, so go out to the parking lot and pick up trash. Like, that's all you're good for. And I just thought like I was above that task. I was too good for it. I was too important. That was too embarrassing of a job for me to do. That's called pride. I was prideful and arrogant and thought I was too good to do a task. That type of attitude will keep us from serving humbly and doing the unexpected and pointing people to Jesus. Because Jesus taught us that night, our takeaway is we are never above serving. You and I are never above serving. We're never too good, too qualified, too important to serve other people. Jesus showed us that very thing that night by doing that lowly task that was reserved for a slave or a servant that wasn't even a Jew. And he did that task. The Son of God, God in the flesh, chose to serve because it's what he came to do. Our Lord and our King was not above serving, and neither are we. If our attitude is, man, I'm too important, I'm too special, or we think, I would never do that task, like that's too embarrassing, then we're not being humble. And we are going to struggle to point people to Jesus and doing the unexpected. Because the world says, hey, don't serve when you're too good or the task is above you, but Jesus says serve on all occasions. So let's have the attitude and heart of humility, because humility is what will help us to never feel we are above serving. So let's serve. Understand, we are to change that diaper. Serve the kids and teenagers. Pick up trash. Clean up. Help someone move. Sit and visit with that person that no one wants to sit with. If you think someone else should serve in this way and not you, then that means maybe you need to check your pride and say, I need to humble myself and serve in that way. Understand, Jesus was never above serving, and neither are we. So we need to serve the way Jesus did. When I read this story and I read this account of Jesus washing the disciples' feet, sometimes I often overlook a pretty big detail in the story. I don't focus on it much, and that is the fact that Jesus washed Judas's feet. As we know, Judas betrays Jesus later that night, and we know Jesus knows this already before he begins washing his disciples' feet, that Jesus is going to betray him, and yet he still washes Judas's feet. He washed the feet of the man that is partly responsible for Jesus getting arrested, beaten, and murdered on the cross the next day. And Jesus got down on one knee and washed his betrayer's feet. Now, I don't know what Jesus was thinking about as he's washing Jesus' feet. I can only speculate. I don't know if it was easy for him or a no-brainer or it was extremely difficult for him. But I know if I was in Jesus' shoes, that would be one of the hardest things to do on earth, to get down on one knee and do this humbling task to a person that I know ultimately hates me and is going to betray me, to love and serve them in such a humbling way. And Jesus washing Jesus' feet that night teaches us we are to serve even when it's difficult. You and I are called through Jesus' actions tonight that we are to serve even when it's difficult and even when it's certain people who are difficult for us to serve. It's hard to serve difficult people. Maybe it's hard to serve them because they've hurt you in some way. Maybe you feel they don't deserve it. Maybe we're dealing with their own pride and selfishness in some way, but when opportunities arrive to serve people, even when they're difficult, we need to serve them. Because difficult people need Jesus too. Because all of us, if we really face it, we are all difficult people to somebody. And all people need Jesus. And serving them when it's hard can be the loving act that points them to a loving God that will offer them love and grace that they desperately need. So we must serve people that are difficult. We need to serve our kids when they've exhausted us past frustration. We need to serve our spouse when things aren't in perfect harmony in our marriage. We need to serve our parents when we feel like they don't understand us or they're making our life difficult. We need to serve our boss when we feel like we're not appreciated. We need to serve our coworkers when they're getting on our last nerves. We need to serve the less fortunate when we feel like this is their fault. They deserve what's coming to them. We need to serve and love our enemies when they have hurt us. We need to do the unexpected by serving when it's difficult. Serving difficult people. And not only are we to serve when people are difficult, we need to serve when we think that the task we're required to do is in fact difficult. A lot of times you and I have been presented with an opportunity to serve in some way and we think, oh, that's too hard. Or that might complicate my life. Or that might make me a little too uncomfortable to serve that way. Whether it's here at church, with our families, in our community, we might think we might have this idea that this might inconvenience me in some way, so therefore I'm going to back out. And we have to say no to that type of mindset. But we have to be willing to say yes to serve and to serve people when it's hard, when it's inconvenient, when it makes us uncomfortable at times. I doubt it was convenient that night for Jesus to get on his knee and wash those just dirty, stinking, disgusting feet, but Jesus did it and he calls us to serve in the same way, to humble ourselves and serve when we think it's inconvenient, it's uncomfortable or difficult, because that's what Jesus did. And those acts of service point people to Jesus. We must do the unexpected and serve people when they're difficult and serve when it's a difficult situation, because that could be the turning point for someone to be led to Jesus. Because if we're followers of Jesus, our goal is to point people to make followers of Jesus. Some of you know my story, but when I was in high school, most of my high school career, I didn't really live for Jesus. And my goal after high school wasn't to go into ministry. I wanted just to go to some school and play college football. Well, the summer before my senior year, I fully gave my life to Jesus at a CIY, and my life was transformed. And I began trying to live for Jesus really for the first time my senior year in high school. And I was trying to figure out, hey, what's this look like? How do I do this? And for some reason, in the middle of the school year, I felt compelled to go to my youth minister and tell him, hey, Cody, I want to lead a Bible study. I have no idea how to lead a Bible study. I don't know what it's like. I barely even read my Bible already, but yet I feel like God's telling me, hey, you should help study the Bible with some other high school guys. So my youth minister got me some materials, got me squared away, and I began on Tuesday night leading a group of high school boys in my mom and dad's basement, studying the Bible and having accountability. And to be honest, I loved it. I enjoyed it so much. It was something I looked forward each and every week, was to serve and lead that Bible study of other guys in my youth group. Now, that youth group was mostly made of underclassmen. There was one junior in the group. The rest were freshmen and sophomores. And I always say the reason I decided to go into ministry was because of leading that group of young men and seeing the impact that I could make in pouring into lives of teenagers is what led me to wanting to go into ministry. And I don't like to speculate about this stuff, but I don't know where I would be in life if I didn't feel compelled by God to serve in that way. I probably wouldn't be in ministry. I would have never met my wife. I wouldn't be up on the stage. My life would be drastically different. And what I can say, what I learned from being willing to step out in faith and serve in that way was serving brings blessings. I've been extremely blessed through that early opportunity as a 17, 18-year-old to serve in that way. And I've watched as countless of other people like you and myself have chosen to serve people and watching them feel blessed. Because Jesus told his disciples that night, if they serve one another, if they humble themselves, they will experience blessings. This word blessings can be translated also to have happiness. You will find happiness, joy, fulfillment if you choose to put other people first and serve them. If you choose to pour out your life and serve other people, you will find joy and happiness that you would never experience in any other way on earth. Sure, a lot of things can bring us happiness or joy, but the ultimate place it comes through Jesus. Through serving, Jesus says, if you put others first, you will be blessed in ways that you can't imagine. So, church, I encourage you, serve because God will bless you. He will take care of you. He will provide for you. He will give you the joy and purpose you have always wanted. But we have to humble ourselves and choose to serve others. We have to choose to put others first. So understand, you and I are not above serving. Jesus wasn't, and neither are we. That we have to serve even when it's difficult, even when it's difficult people. And if we do that, we will experience joy and happiness and fulfillment. Because Paul said, you and I were created to do good works. You and I were made to serve and love people. If you serve when it's hard, when it's difficult, you will find joy. If you serve when you don't want to, you will find joy and happiness. If you serve when it's inconvenient, you will find joy. If you choose to serve, you will point people to Jesus. Church, if we call ourselves followers of Jesus, we want to point people to Jesus. We want to make followers of Jesus. We want people to feel the love of Jesus. We want people to know it. So my question for you this morning is, where do you need to serve? Where is God putting on your heart that you need to serve, that you need to put others first, that you need to do acts of service to point people to Jesus? Where do you need to humble yourselves and serve? Where do you need to do the unexpected and put others first? Is it in your marriage or your family? Is it at work or at school or among your friends? Is it to serve the lowly, to serve the less fortunate? Is it to serve your community some way, or is it to serve right here at this church and help grow the faith of other followers of Jesus? Where do you need to serve? Because if we serve with humility, you and I will point people to Jesus. So here's what I want to do just to end our time this morning. I want to just give you some quiet moments to yourself to ask God that question. God, where do I need to serve? I want to give you a minute or two just to spend time praying to God and have Him put on your heart, where do I need to serve? Is it somewhere here in church? Is it to better serve my wife and kids, or my husband and my kids, my family, my parents, at school, at work, wherever it is? Take that time right now. I'll give you quiet moments, and then I'll come back and close us out. Spend some time in prayer. God, I just ask for pride to be removed from my life, pride to be removed from all our lives, to not think we're above serving, but to know and trust that you have a plan and purpose for us to do good works and to serve others. I pray, God, it is just so clear to all of us in this room how we can serve in ways that point people to Jesus, God. I pray I just ask, and just take away our pride, our arrogance, and that we just want to be servants, God. We want to be servants of you. Help me to do that, God. Help all of us to do that, Lord. Thank you so much, Jesus, for dying on the cross. Thank you so much for giving up your life and giving us that example of humility. Help us all to be defined by our humility, Lord. It's your Son's name I pray. Amen. Well, church, I hope God has put something on your heart to serve. And if you need someone to talk to about that or pray with, someone, the 103 would love to just spend some time talking with you and pray with you that. But let's stand and let's worship together.